There are two basic ways to talk about the past in Spanish, the imperfect tense and the preterite tense. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense is used to talk about ongoing or repetitive past actions. We'll talk about that a little bit, but our focus here is actually to learn how to use the imperfect tense, not so much to learn what it's used for. We'll cover that later on. However, as long as we're here, we'll take a look at it for a minute. When we say ongoing or repetitive past actions, we really mean two things. The imperfect tense is used to talk about things you were doing or things you used to do. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. An example of something that you were doing would be to say, I was eating supper. We would use the imperfect tense to say that. An example of something you used to do might be to say, I used to play baseball. Of course, it doesn't have to be I, it doesn't have to be you, it could be anybody. George used to play baseball or whatever. But this is what the imperfect tense is used for. Again, our focus, though, is going to be on how to use it, not so much when to use it. We'll get to that more later on. At this point, you should be familiar with the verb chart. Here you see two verb charts, one for AR verbs and one for ER and IR verbs. These are the verb endings for the imperfect tense. And if you're familiar with the verb chart, you should know how to use these. Let's take a look at a couple of examples, though, beginning with the AR verbs. Maybe we want to say I used to work at a restaurant. We'll use the verb trabajar, an AR verb. To do that, of course, we're going to follow the steps that you're already used to. We cut off the AR. We look to find our correct ending, which in this case is aba. And we add that on. Then we just have to add in the other words. So yo trabajaba en un restaurante. And there we have it. The process is simple. It's no different than what you're used to with the present tense. You simply have to use the correct endings now from the imperfect tense verb chart. Let's look at one example from the ER and IR verb chart as well. Maybe this time we want to use the verb vivir to say they were living in Venezuela. Again, we follow the same steps that we're used to. We're going to cut off the IR. We're going to look. This time our subject is they, so we'll take the ellos ending, ian. And then we fill out the rest of our sentence. So nothing too difficult here. Again, the same steps that you should already be used to with the present tense. But we just have to make sure that we know our verb charts, the AR verb chart and the ER and IR verb chart. One of the nicest things about the imperfect tense is that there are only 3 irregular verbs in the imperfect tense. Everything else follows the rules 100%. Those 3 verbs are ser, ir, and ver. So let's take a minute and go over those in the imperfect tense, and then you'll practically be an expert. Here are the 3 irregulars. I'm not going to go through each of these word for word, but do notice that these are the entire words, not endings. You might want to pause the video and write these down in your notes because it is important to know them. Also, you may notice that the yo form and the el, ella, usted form is identical on each of these. You may have noticed that with the regular endings as well, and we'll take a look at that one more time before the end of the video. That's not a mistake. These are, in fact, identical. So we have to just use the context to help us know whether we're looking at the yo form or the el, ella, usted form in those cases. And so one last time, here we have our regular endings. The AR endings, aba, abas, aba, abamos, abais, aban. Notice the identical endings here, aba and aba for the yo form and the el, ella, usted form. And ia, ias, ia, iamos, iais, ian. Again, we have the identical forms in first and third person here. Notice as well that each of these forms for ER and IR verbs has an accent mark on the I. Make sure you've got that in your notes. And notice that for the AR verbs, only the nosotros form has an accent mark, and the vosotros form. And one last time then, the imperfect tense is used for ongoing or repetitive past actions. In other words, things you were doing or things you used to do.